Hi everyone, thanks for being here. So we'll get right into it. What I thought I'd do is just kind of, this is, as Fran said, the fourth, and it's the final kind of talk in the series. So what we want to try and do in this one is kind of bring the things from the previous three together. So we want to try and draw together what we have been talking about and looking at. So that'll give a bit of a context. So rather than just go straight into the youth ministry piece, I thought it might be helpful to go, where have we come from? And then to understand why that might shape what we're trying to do in youth ministry. So, as I said, 4 talks. The first one was looking at the signs of the times and particularly understanding what we mean by secularity. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit, we'll cover all those things briefly in a moment. Then the second one was looking at the church's process of evangelisation. The third one was to revisit how we do conversion, or what conversion means. And then the fourth one today is reimagining youth ministry. So if we're going to have a little look at the story so far, as a little summation of where we've been, the first thing to be saying, I think, was, remember we talked about Pope Francis's statement that we're not just living in an era of change. It's axiomatic that we're living in a time where there's all sorts of changes happening in our world, but it's now to recognise also that it's actually a change of era. That since the 60s, as far as someone called Charles Taylor's concerned, we've been living in a moment of change that, you know, its closest analogue is about 500 years ago, with the birth of the modern period in the Reformation. So we're talking about one of the huge changes of the Western world, of Western culture, and we're living in the middle of that. That always presents some challenges, but it also presents some opportunities as well. And hopefully that's part of what we've been looking at over the course of the 4 lectures. To understand that idea of secularity a little better, we looked at the thought of Charles Taylor, who's a Canadian philosopher. And in particular, Taylor suggested that we live in an age of authenticity, that there's a moral ideal at work in our culture where people understand that there's a unique way for them to discover what it is to be a human being and to realise their humanity. And that ideal is profoundly at work Taylor would argue within each of us in the Western world, that we want to be true to ourselves as we understand ourselves to be. What that produces in the realm of spirituality or faith is an understanding of spirituality as a quest. And so that there are people who are seeking, they're searching for something more. If people are going to be looking for some way of understanding themselves and their identity in the light of relationship or of faith, then what they're going to experience that as fundamentally is that they're seeking, they're searching for something more. Taylor contrasts that with dwellers. That's those people who live with some kind of awareness that there's a religious authority external to them that actually shapes their lives. And that can take various shapes and forms, from the church to the Bible, to authority figures in people's lives. But the idea is that there's somebody outside of us or something outside of us that actually shapes our belief, our religious belief. Taylor contrasts those two while he acknowledges that they're both ideal types. So there's a bit of a seeker and a bit of a dweller in most of us. That was the first lecture. The second one looked at the process of evangelisation in the church. Okay, and I went back to the Second Vatican Council and to ad gentes. That's what AG means. Ad gentes, particularly the second chapter of ad gentes, which describes a process of evangelisation. I've briefly outlined those there in those dot points, that there's an important place for witness and dialogue and presence in love. Then there's a really important dimension of the proclamation of the gospel and the response of faith and conversion. The next step would be about the catechumenate. Somebody becomes a catechumen, and we'll remember that the catechumenate was restored, or the process of bringing people into the church was restored at the Second Vatican Council. So the catechumenate is that process of deeper formation leading up to baptism. So initiation, one of the things that happened just prior to the council was that they returned the prime time for initiating adults to Easter, not the only time, but they said this is the most important or most fitting moment for initiating adults. It's at Easter. And so then the following sort of period after that is what's called mystagogy, which is a reflection upon the mysteries of baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist. And then at Gentes, what happens next is that a new Christian community is formed. That process gets expressed again through the RCIA. So when the RCIA is declared or promulgated, if you like, what happens next is that you have those stages that we saw in the previous slide get embedded in the RCIA. They get embedded in the process by which somebody goes from, I don't believe in Christ, his gospel, the church, to a process by which they become an active member, or what we might call, to use a later language, a missionary disciple in the life of the church. And so you can see the same process is being described here in the RCIA. I mentioned that part of that is because some of the people who are involved in drafting that decree on missionary activity and the people who were involved in developing the RCIA were the same people. Those two groups overlapped. So that was the end of the second lecture. The third lecture looked at the RCIA as its process of conversion. And I suggested there that there are 4 key features of that process of conversion, a little bit different to maybe how sometimes the word conversion is used, especially in youth ministry, which is, it might be to describe a particular moment where a young person says, well, I had a conversion. What they're saying is, at that moment, I no longer didn't believe, but now I do. I was no longer in darkness, now I've seen the light, like that kind of, particularly a strong emphasis on it being like a really clear, single kind of moment. And I suggested that what we probably need is a richer understanding of conversion that can allow for those sorts of significant moments, because they do happen, but to recognise that it's part of a much bigger process, that as well as it being about a new relationship with Jesus, it's actually a new relationship with the triune God, the God who loves us. Like a truly authentic experience and encounter with Jesus leads us to the Father, and it happens in and through the power of the Holy Spirit. And in a sense, the Holy Spirit's also the goal or the outcome of the process too, because the indwelling presence of the Spirit within us is the presence of God alive and at work in us. We talked about it being something that God does, but also that it's deeply human, that the goal of conversion is that I be drawn into a deep new relationship with God that will culminate in meeting God face to face. But it also involves me becoming more truly human, that I actually discover and realise what it means to be fully human. And I quoted Gaudium et Spes number 22, which says that Jesus does not simply reveal who God is to us, but he reveals who we are to ourselves. That to be saved, if you like, in inverted commas, is also to experience and realise what it is to be truly human. Closely related to that concept is the idea that this is transformative of the whole person. So it's not just in conversion, in coming to faith, it's not just that I have a new set of categories or new content, new ideas about what I believe, but it's actually changing me as a human being, that the whole of my person is being changed. And we looked about, in order to kind of unpack that a little bit, we looked at Donald Gelpy's theology of conversion, where he described different dimensions of conversion, that part of how I'm transformed is I'm transformed affectively. That's in my affect. So from negative affect, which are things like guilt and shame and fear, and more positively, I'm also transformed to appreciation of beauty, capacity to recognise and identify beauty when I encounter it. An intellectual conversion, that there is a cognitive dimension to faith and there are new ideas and concepts, but also that that's grounded in a more holistic kind of understanding of the human person, of what it means to know, and that that's actually something that happens at a more intuitive kind of level. And then there's the specific, if you like, data of faith. So the first act of faith is a global dimension of faith that affects me at the whole of my, at the deepest level of who I am, if you like. But there's also a cognitive dimension, which is a whole new set of ideas about what I believe. Gelpy also talks about moral conversion, that I move from perhaps a life that is somewhat self-centered and focused upon me to a life that's actually other-centered, that's selfless and that's oriented towards love. Socio-political conversion is that I also have an orientation towards justice, that I recognise that part of realising that the world is not as God intends it to be is that I realise that there are systems and structures in our world that actually militate against everyone's full dignity in Christ, their full dignity as sons and daughters of God. And so all of those happen in the context of a conversion that is actually grounded in an encounter with God's love flooding our hearts, as it says in the letter to the Romans. I also talked a little bit about Rambo's understanding of conversion. So again, I'm so tempted to just put a picture of Sly Stallone up there, but I resisted. Just different steps like Rambo. So Rambo creates a model that draws together all sorts of different understandings of conversion and studies of conversion, from psychological to missiological to sociological. And he comes up with these different stages. I won't go through those, but just to say that this shapes what will come next in the conversation we're about to have. So to just kind of sum up that summary, if I could, one of the things that I pointed out or tried to sort of give you a bit of an understanding of was that this is an exercise in what we might call practical theology. So to try and unpack or to try and describe what we've done over the last 3 lectures, and then to look to the 4th, is to do this. That in blue there you can see the fundamental kind of question, that when we ask the question of what's going on with young people in relation to faith today, perhaps the popular or instinctive response is young people are either leaving the church or have got little interest in the church in the first place. And a common response to that we found was that secularism is the issue. And then also that leads then to an understanding of, well, we need to evangelise young people because we want to try and get them back, if you like, or reach them or connect with them in some way. What I've tried to do is to say, let's actually go a little bit deeper in those 2 things. So the second step in a practical theology is to say, well, what insights are there from the social sciences? And in particular, I've actually drawn, maybe not so much from social science, but of philosophy. You might remember that I looked at a sociological study, which was the largest study of young people, called The Spirit of Generation Y, largest sociological study of young Australians in relation to faith. And I said, you know what, if we actually look at that in the light of Charles Taylor's thought, we might get a deeper understanding of young people's responses to faith. Then we looked at, so that was that very first lecture. The second lecture then said, well, let's look at evangelisation more closely and see if we can understand that more richly and deeply. And so we looked at the RCIA. And so that's the theological piece. So we tried to understand why we see the phenomenon of less young people being interested or coming to church or caring about faith. We tried to understand why that might be happening from a sociological and a philosophical perspective. Then we've asked the question, okay, well, what resources from theology have we got to be able to do this better? Which brings us to the last point and to today's topic, which is, what are we going to do about it? In the light of what we've learned, what might we do differently? Okay, so that's the focus of today. So one way of putting that might be we're thinking about youth ministry in the light of the RCIA. What I want to suggest is, remember that the RCIA is a process for initiating adults into Christian faith. And so in theory, the RCIA begins with somebody who has no interest in faith and takes them on a process, on a journey, which culminates in their baptism and confirmation and first Eucharist, and then they're living fully the life of the Christian community. What I've suggested is that that process, which originally belonged to a context, it originally belonged in a very much a missionary kind of context, a context that when the world was divided up into places that were Christian and weren't, it belonged to that context of where someone was a missionary in a foreign kind of country. But as the world has changed over the 50 years since the Second Vatican Council and the 40 or so years since the RCIA was developed, what we can talk about now, I think, is that process with a few changes can be applied to the practice of young people in different stages of whether they're unbaptised young people, whether they're whether they're nominally baptised but maybe aren't living out their faith, or whether they're the children of practising parents. And I've called that, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but I've called that the initiatory dynamic of youth ministry. What I'm saying there is that the process that we see in the RCIA is a dynamic that should be a dynamic of initiation, if you like, that should be embedded in all of the process of working with young people in youth ministry. That there's a process here that we can pay attention to that actually can be applied to what we're doing with young people. So you'll see in this definition that it picks up the things that we've been talking about in the previous talks. So the first one is to say that a faith community ought to follow a process of evangelisation, which is that process that we saw in Vatican II and in the RCIA. What's that process look like? Well, first of all, it's geared towards, or enables, as it were, young people's conversion, okay, in all the richness of that term that we've described earlier. What does that process include? Well, the practices of witness, the proclamation of the gospel, young people sharing fully in the community's life, mission and worship, with the only exception being that for those who are unbaptised young people, that they can't participate fully in the liturgy of the Eucharist. But in every other respect, we're embedding them into the life of the faith community. And then also, not just, also through a process then rather of catechesis and ritual as well. So actual instruction and ritual moments. And we'll unpack that and talk about that more in just a moment. That process and those practices leads to sacramental initiation or its appropriation. So again, I come to the point that for an unbaptised young person, the culmination of this process is that they're fully initiated into the life of faith and into the life of the church. So they're baptised, confirmed, and they receive Eucharist for the first time. But for the children of practising parents, so that's kids who've been raised in church, if you like, also for those who were perhaps baptised in infancy, but for one reason or another have been out of that life of practice, what's required there is an appropriation or the fulfilment, if you like, of the initiation that was given to them at their baptism through their confirmation and Eucharist. Where does this process ultimately conclude? It concludes in a sense it concludes, but it's really the end of the beginning, because they enter into the ongoing life of missionary discipleship in the church. So just to make clear again, this process it's the same dynamic, but it kind of has three dimensions to it, or three parts. For unbaptised adolescents, this is technically called the rite of Christian initiation of adults or the rite of Christian initiation of children. You've got to decide at what point the rite of Christian initiation of children becomes the rite of Christian initiation of adults, depending on the young person's age. But for nominally Christian young people, they go through the same process, but they appropriate their initiation. We don't baptise them again, we don't confirm them again, but they've actually taken hold of the grace that was given to them through their sacramental initiation. And the same goes for the children of practising parents, because they've got to make an act of faith where they say, the faith that I received from my parents, the faith that I was raised in, I've got to make my own. And I do that through a personal act of faith where I say, yes, I want the gift that was given to me in and through my sacramental initiation to take hold in my life. Okay? Is that okay? We've been moving pretty quickly. To try and just sort of set a bit of context and then say, okay, what should this look like? So we've been talking about the fact that there's the one initiatory dynamic, but it looks a little bit different with these three different groups of young people. One of the things that we do want to just stress, it is really important to make a clear distinction between number 1 and numbers 2 and 3 here on the screen. And that's because of the significance of baptism, okay? Baptism is an unrepeatable sacrament, and when somebody is baptised, they enter into the life of the church, and when they fulfil that, they complete their initiation through confirmation and Eucharist, they are fully members of the life of the church. But we also need to acknowledge at the same time, baptism isn't fruitful in somebody's life unless there's a personal appropriation through active faith. Now, this can happen in adolescence, but we also want to acknowledge it can happen at other stages of people's lives as well, okay? But what's required is that personal appropriation in faith of the gospel. In other words, people have gone through the process that we've just been describing and have said yes to it. Okay, so what are some of the implications of all of this, and particularly of the process that I've just described? Well, the first thing that I want to say, isn't that a really sensational graphic? Do you like that one? It took me ages to do this one, I'll tell you. So, long time. It is the product of deep thought, Pat, I promise. What it's to say is that it's the end, I think, of the youth group model, okay? It's the end of a youth group model. So in Australia, since really Antioch, the kind of predominant process, or the predominant model, if you like, of youth ministry has been, we gather all the kids, usually on a Friday night or a Sunday night, and it's a one-size-fits-all kind of reality, okay? So whether you're, and so back in the days of Antioch, that kind of worked for a good 10 years. That sort of worked because the group of kids that Antioch was trying to reach were all pretty similar in their attitude and stage of faith. They were usually almost exclusively, not quite perhaps, but almost exclusively, the children of practicing parents who were kind of on the edge of faith in some way or another. And so Antioch did a magnificent job of reaching those young people, okay? And so I'm just conscious as I look out about how many Antiochers I can see in the room. But that is absolutely true, okay? The problem, of course, is that as young people, as the range of young people's responses and as the recognition of the church goes that it can't just be the kids of practicing parents that we're reaching out to, that what we find is that the group of young people gets kind of broader and less homogenous, okay? So what Antioch did was it started off with a weekend, and that built and presumed so much of faith already that they'd been raised with as children, and then gave them a chance to personally respond. So we might call that stage one of this process. And then stage two was every Antioch night that happened after that, okay? And then it'd be reaffirmed and deepened when you came back on the weekend. This time now you're on the team, okay? Really a wonderful model, in all sincerity, a really wonderful model. But the problem, as you can see, is you get a really discrete group now. You've got a real range of people now, from the most initial of seekers, so a young person who's barely interested, maybe just trusts one other person or a couple of people who are people of faith, through to the young people who actually have grown up in faith and in really, perhaps a really active faith community. Their parents have been super committed, and those young people want to grow. They're really keen and hungry and eager to learn, okay, and to grow and deepen in their faith. If you have one night to reach those two groups of people, you find that you try and land in the middle, and maybe you don't meet either of them very well. It's too religious for the non-churchy kids, and it's not meaty enough for the churchy kids, if I can put it crudely, yeah? So what tended to happen then is that you'd get two different kinds of youth groups that would emerge. One parish might say, you know what, we know we've got lots of kids who aren't very connected, so we're going to do a really social kind of thing, okay? Leaves the kids who actually want to go a bit deeper saying, well, there's nothing here for me. I've got a friendship group. I don't need something that isn't going to offer me more meat. Can I put it like that? Alternatively, other groups go, you know what, we've got to really make sure these kids understand what they believe, and they've got to try and teach them, and it's a really, kind of earnest kind of, let's really talk about faith and really present it as fully as we possibly can. And it leaves a young person who's kind of just coming into that going, I really don't know what this is about and I don't understand it, and it doesn't meet them. I remember one example from one of our youth groups from some years ago where the youth group had settled into a very solid core of very committed young people, terrific bunch, and they probably weren't necessarily, and there's a dynamic that happens where that group kind of is just so consolidated that it's hard for someone to come into it, right? As that process happened, they did found one day that two young guys did come, but it just so happened that the talk that night at the youth group was on fasting. And these two young people have no background in faith. And so they come in, and the first thing that they're hearing about is this kind of concept of giving up food for the sake of the world, offering it as intercession and all that, and they're just bewildered as to what's going on here, and they don't come back, right? So it's missed them because it wasn't able to gear towards them. So the thing that we're talking about here is we need to develop some stages and steps in the process, that it can't be a case of one size fits all. So if we apply the process of evangelisation to youth ministry in this way, then I think we end up with something like this. The 4 stages of the RCIA could look a little bit like this. So the pre-catechumenate, I'm calling evangelisation. In that narrow sense of the term evangelisation, remember I said that there's one way of understanding evangelisation, which is bringing the good news into every aspect of society, okay? There's a narrower understanding of evangelisation that's also used in the church's documents, including the RCIA, which says that evangelisation is that process by which we go from no faith in Jesus to a belief in Jesus, okay? It's only an initial thing, okay? So that's what the RCIA uses, and I've kept the terminology there, okay? That the first stage needs to be some kind of step of evangelisation. The second step, the equivalent of the catechumenate, I'm calling formation, okay? And it happens on the back of that evangelisation stage, okay? And we might call that a process by which a young person who's experienced an initial encounter with Jesus, an initial experience of God's love, is now seeking to deepen and grow in that. You can spot these young people because they're hungry, right? They show up at everything, okay? Even a lecture on a Saturday afternoon, right? Okay? So they're keen, they're hungry, they want to learn, they want to grow, they want to know more, yeah? Okay? So they've experienced an initial encounter and they want to deepen in that encounter and discover more from that encounter. And so at this point, we want to make sure that we're forming them. I'm going to unpack each of these in some more detail. The RCIA, of course, its third stage is the period of Lent, it's called the period of purification and enlightenment. It's a period of intense spiritual preparation leading up to baptism, confirmation, and First Eucharist. And so there's no reason, I don't think, why, with appropriate kind of transposition, appropriate kind of translating of the step, we couldn't have something like this in our youth ministries, that Lent would be an experience of renewal and preparation for either sacramental initiation in the case of the unbaptised, or that kind of time of appropriation, fully saying, yes, I believe all of this, I believe in Jesus, I believe what God's done for us in Christ and through the power of the Spirit, and I want to live my life as a disciple of his, okay? And so young people can appropriate that or be renewed in it. And then the fourth and final step is that mystagogy, which is the idea of unpacking the mysteries. So it's a reflection upon what people have experienced. You might remember that I said that the origins of this go back to at least the 4th century, where people didn't know too much. They didn't have a lot explained to them. There was a secrecy around what the rites of initiation would look like. And so what happened was they knew that they were going to have a bath of some sort. They didn't realise that they were going to be plunged into the water. They didn't realise that they were going to be dressed in a white garment. They didn't realise that oil was going to be smeared all over them. And so what happened then was that they talked about and unpacked those things. They'd say, the bishops who would teach them would say, you remember how you were thrown into the water, and then as you came up, that was a dying with Jesus and a rising with Jesus, and they would explain that, okay? Sometimes that secrecy is understood to be a reflection of the fact that at that point the church is persecuted and you don't want to kind of give away the secrets, as it were. Probably something in that. Other scholars would also say too that this is actually fantastic pedagogy. This is a great way to actually explain something or to help people experientially learn something. You give them a really rich, deep experience and then you unpack that in a more cognitive kind of way, okay? So there's that final step then of doing that. And I think that there's an important place for that kind of learning in youth ministry, okay? It doesn't have to wait, I don't think, until this moment. It can actually happen earlier on in the process. So is that okay as a setting up of the kind of framework that I'm suggesting? That we want youth ministry to be a process because it's a process that can meet young people at different stages on that journey, yeah? And can take people through that journey. Is that okay? Any comments or questions at this point? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, great. So the question was that there are often young people who they were raised as Catholics in their family. At some point they stopped coming to church, okay, stopped practicing their faith in a regular way, and how does this process kind of meet them? Well, I think that the response to that would be to say that this process would meet them right at the very beginning of it and say, okay, let's actually, as it were, rebuild something here and try and find ways in which, and we'll go through these steps, ways in which the faith community, and particularly young people perhaps within the faith community, might provide a witness to such young people, invite them to hear the gospel, invite them then to grow in faith and deepen in faith to the point where they actually do say, you know what, It's like I think I used this concept of rather than they've not believed still, they haven't kept believing the whole way through, but now they're believing again. Yeah? So they're now personally saying, yeah, the faith that I was raised with, maybe they've come and they've reconfigured that a little bit. They've thought things that they understood, some of the things that maybe they thought, I don't buy this or I don't believe it, or maybe things that they thought were about Christian faith that they have to kind of unlearn as well. And they say, actually, no, I really believe what the gospel is now. I really have encountered Jesus and I really do want to follow him. So you would actually say, okay, well, let's go on that whole process. You'd want to try and take them on that whole process. Okay? Yeah. I think that's really true. I think, so for a young person who's had some experience of being raised in faith and has, for whatever reason, said, I'm not interested, one of the great challenges of that is that they really believe that they know what it is, right? Well, I mean, you know, there could be a little bit of kind of hubris or even maybe arrogance on the young person's part, but there's a very real chance too that they never heard the gospel properly, right? And so what they've rejected is perhaps a caricature or what they thought was faith and what Christian faith means, but they've rejected kind of a caricature of that or I sometimes use the image of like, you know, you can get those coffee substitute drinks like, what do you call it? Yeah, so it's the idea is it's ersatz, okay? It's not real. So like a hickory drink is not coffee, right? So when young people sometimes walk away, what they're rejecting actually is not the gospel, but what they think is the gospel. And so they're saying, I don't really like the hickory drink, Echo or whatever it's called, but they actually haven't really tasted the coffee, yeah? So that.
All right. I'm thinking of my own family in this particular case, and children raised Catholic, gone to Catholic schools, all that. Then they don't practice their Catholic. They have a child, and the child needs baptising, and they re-engage with the church for whatever reason or another, sometimes through straight-out force, because they want to send the child to a Catholic school and the child has to be baptised. I mean, we're very plain here. Where within that process of a child being baptised would this sort of thing fit for the parents of that child?
Yep. So I think that's a really good question. So here's an opportunity where, as you say, people now adults, they've got kids of their own who have in some way or another walked away. How do they re-engage? How do we re-engage with them when they present their child for baptism? Again, I would say you go right back to the beginning. So here's this moment of initial connection. You try and find a way of saying, how do we provide a context for you to actually, first of all, come to a place of trust of the Christian community, because it's probably possibly quite minimal if all you want, if your intention when you come is, I just want the child baptised, I don't plan to engage any more deeply than that, but I do want my child baptised. It's an opportunity for us as a church to say, okay, how do we provide a more meaningful witness for you that you're actually intrigued and are drawn or attracted by what you see, and then how do we provide a context by which you also then hear the gospel? So I've used the example of what we're trying at St Declan's, which is to say that Alpha would present such an opportunity, right? You're trying to provide a context for those things to happen. Okay, so what we might do is make a little start just for a little bit on sort of drawing out or unpacking each of those elements, and then we'll have a break and then we'll come back for the second part of our afternoon. So remember in stage one, that first stage, we're calling that the evangelisation stage. So the first characteristic of this stage is it needs to be a stage of witness, okay? And I've called that relational witness. Youth ministry, it's sort of axiomatic. It's almost a cliche of youth ministry that it's all about relationships. And I want to just qualify that a little bit and say it's all about a certain kind of relationship, okay? And so what I'm trying to bring together is an understanding of the relationships that form the heart of youth ministry, but it's about a witness of those relationships. So remember, we talked, if the macro context of young people in our culture is the power of secularity to actually say, and particularly through that ethic of authenticity, is to say, don't go look into the church because the church will tell you what you should believe. Remember, young people are allergic to that because you've got to work it out for yourself. Part of being true to myself is nobody can tell me. I've got to work that out for myself, okay? So if that's the macro context, there is still a place for the micro context, which is the context of family and friends. That there's a place for those relationships to be a witness to a young person to the truth of the gospel. Okay, and that can be also, it's in and through. So let me start again. So the magisterial statements, the church's teaching calls this witness, but we've got to recognise that that's fundamentally, it's not like an abstract category. I'm a witness to you. It's I'm Chris, who is your friend or your brother or your family member, and I'm also a person who's a follower of Christ, and that my life and the life of those people that are closest around me ought to speak of and provide a question around the truth of the gospel. Perhaps in the time of Antioch, the category of witness could be a little bit bigger, because you'd be able to look at another young person of the same age, particularly if they went to the same Catholic school as you, and say, you know what, we've got a pretty similar life experience. And so if you saw a young person talking about faith in that context, you might be able to say, well, I can identify myself with you. I can see a bit of me in you. I want to suggest that now that category of witness is much smaller, because there's such a diversity of young people in their relationship to God and their response. And so what we really need here is a relationship of trust to exist, okay? And so where once upon a time I might hear somebody's testimony or their story of faith, or I might, I didn't necessarily have to know them very well, but because they looked a lot like me, I could say, yeah, I want that, right? Now I think it's much more likely that it's going to come from a place of, here's a person that I really know. Here's someone that's a friend. Here's someone that I trust. He's a family member that I can rely on, and it's their witness that's powerful. That's more challenging, isn't it? Okay, it's a narrower kind of place for the church's witness to take place in.
Sorry, but at the end of the day, Jesus was just with the 12, wasn't he? It's only a small group.
Sure. Yep. So another category that we could draw upon here is from the RCIA, which is the category of the sponsor. So in the RCIA's kind of vision, what you have is a sponsor was someone who said, yeah, these people are ready or this person is ready to take a step out of that initial evangelisation stage and into the catechumenate. But also, if you look at the RCIA closely about what it says about the sponsor, for them to actually testify to the readiness of a person to take that step, we're told that they actually invite and introduce people to the Christian community. So there's something about the sponsor's relationship here that is an evangelising kind of role. Their informal witness, if you like, can lead to inquiry and to the point of someone becoming sympathetic to Christian faith. So the category of sponsor can be a helpful way to think about that understanding of what witness is supposed to look like. That it's actually by the way in which we live our lives and a walking with and accompanying with a person to the point where they're ready to say, I've heard the gospel and I want to make a response of faith. One of the things that I think is really important to stress here is that we can't, and this is an important critique of youth ministry sometimes, I think, and that is that sometimes in our desire and passion for young people to come to know Christ and to follow him, we can instrumentalise those relationships. What do I mean by that? I mean that the relationship matters it becomes a means to an end. And so we want a relationship with a young person so that they might know Christ, but there's a sense in which we've actually bypassed the fact that relationship is a good thing in and of itself, and that to care for and love and support a young person is actually, you can't make that a means to an end. You can't. So whether a young person responds to the gospel or not, whether they say yes or not, our task as a Christian community is to love others as we've been loved by Christ. I think that's an important critique, because I think sometimes in the name of evangelisation of young people, we've kind of made the relationship and the desire for witness an end in itself. One of the beautiful parts of the magisterial statements, the teaching of the church on this category of witness, is it talks about the fact that it's got to be grounded in the love of Jesus, the love and the shape that Jesus' love, which of course is a disinterested kind of love. It's a love that's prepared to go to the point of death for the sake of the other. That's the ultimate ground of this witness. That it's actually, we're not doing it for some kind of end. We're certainly not doing it as a recruitment strategy, kind of, if I can put it like that. We're doing it because we're called to love as Jesus is loved. Okay? The second category there, or the second point there, is around receiving seekers. Remember, I was saying that in the age of authenticity, if you're going to embark upon the quest, as it were, you're looking for some kind of spiritual dimension to your life as a way of understanding who you are and what you're about, then what will happen in this is that you become a seeker. You're searching, you're looking for something. And as we've said, for most young people, it probably doesn't even occur to them to look to the church, because the church looks like somebody who's telling them, okay? And there's an allergy to that in the age of expressive individualism, where I've got to work out for myself what it means for me to be me and what it means for me to be who I was created or made to be. So we need to recognise that search then more often than not, does not lead via the church. However, someone like Charles Taylor will say that it actually can lead people, in the sense that the quest can have different steps along the way. People can be searching, and sometimes, again, if they meet somebody or a group of people who they are drawn to and whose presentation of faith, if you like, resonates with them, they will be drawn to just such a community of faith, okay? But it's not kind of a natural, easy kind of fit. We don't want to underestimate the challenge of that, because the moment that we, as members of the church, and particularly as we represent the church in some ways, we start trying to talk about faith, we've got to recognise that there's a massive cultural pressure that kicks in that says, that instinctively inside a young person says, I've got to work this out for myself. You can't tell me what I should believe. So this is where there's a really important place, I think, for being able to work out, how do we receive seekers? How do we receive them? How do we provide places within the church where a young person can come and explore without being told too quickly, you've got to believe this or you don't get to belong, or you've got to behave like this or you don't get to belong? How do we create some places within the church where it's okay for them to be kind of exploring without a commitment that really feels premature to them, and in fact probably is premature, because they haven't really worked out for themselves what they really understand and believe here? How do we do that? I want to suggest it's really, really challenging, but the RCIA particularly would say that there's an important nature here of respecting people's individual journeys, okay? That's the first point, that we want to respect each person's individual journey. And so there isn't a one-size-fits-all in the responses that we would make here. Charles Taylor uses Taizé as an example of such a way of holding young people. Okay, and so some of the practices of Taizé, a week at Taizé, which is normally what a young person would go to. So Taizé is a French community. It's ecumenical, okay? And it's a community where young people come in their thousands, especially over the summer, thousands each week for every week of the summer. The practices that are involved include things like, it's firstly loosely structured upon Holy Week, okay? And so there are really important rituals around gathering around a cross and around candles, sort of mimicking the Easter Vigil, if you like. But these are things that young people can tap into and experience at their own kind of level, okay? They also have a scenario where they have the monks of the community gather around the edge of the church, and a young person can just go up and pull up a chair and ask them whatever they like and talk to them, okay? So the onus is not on it's not so much a talk where the monk's saying, here's what you need to know. The young person actually just engages in a dialogue where they're the initiator of the dialogue, okay? So there's something about that, I think, that's impressive and important, that here's a place where young people can feel like they've got some agency. They're not being told, but they're actually exploring, as it were, on their terms. I think we have to be able to provide those sorts of places and spaces, partly because that's actually got a lot more integrity about it, okay? But also because otherwise we just simply bang up against that wall of we're being told what to believe, okay? Another part of this would be to say that we want to foster those different other kinds of conversion. So you remember I briefly mentioned today and what we were focusing on in the last lecture, which is that there are different dimensions of conversion and that these are deeply human activities. So when a young person experiences healing of negative affect, healing in shame, fear, guilt in those areas in their life, and that sometimes that can just happen simply by being part of a community that welcomes them, that provides a non-judgmental, trusting, safe expression for them. That can be a healing moment in and of itself. It doesn't necessarily require more dramatic kind of instances of healing, if you like, but some of those negative affects, some of the wounds, we might say, of life can be healed simply by coming into a place that accepts and cares for us. That when we provide that kind of opportunity, that's actually helping a young person to become more truly who they were created to be. When we help young people experience an appreciation for beauty, there's an experience of effective conversion there too. So there's something about, I think, fostering in young people that aesthetic kind of capability where they're able to appreciate beauty, whether that's in the arts, but I think particularly perhaps in the natural creation. That's actually really valuable and important. And again, it's a good thing in itself. When we encourage young people to have intellectual curiosity, when we encourage them not to just take things as they are, not to just accept it because it's been said, but to actually be able to investigate it, to think about it critically, to engage with it, something helpful happens there for them, where they're given the capacity to think critically, okay? This is also something that we can offer, it's a place that we can offer. The church isn't associated with that, but it really should be. We have a deep, rich vein of intellectual stimulation and tradition where people have investigated and critiqued and examined what we believe in all sorts of ways. We ought to be able to provide places for that for young people, not just in regards to faith, but in regards to their lives. When we help young people develop what we might call moral virtue, when we help them to realise that they're not just living for themselves, but there's something far more life-giving in living for others, we're also providing a place where they can experience that kind of moral conversion that Donald Gelpie talks about. And lastly, but by no means least, when we provide opportunities for them to pursue works of mercy, where they're caring for the sick, the suffering, the disadvantaged, or where they're able to pursue questions around justice, okay, to address injustice in some way, we're helping that socio-political conversion to take place in their lives. I want to stress that all these things are good things in themselves, and if we've helped young people do that in the context of church, if they actually at the end of that say, that's really lovely, thanks very much for all you've given me, and walk away, our heart for them to know Christ, in that respect, we might be sad, but we've actually served them still. And I think that that's really important, yeah? I think that's got deep value. What this also does, though, in Gelpie's understanding of conversion, is that these things actually help us, they prepare us for conversion. So he talks about conversion in one aspect of life, can help a conversion in another aspect. So if I'm intellectually converted, I'm more likely to become morally converted, or I'm more likely to become socio-politically converted. And then that's also true then of coming to faith. So that these things kind of interweave together. There's not necessarily a really clear, this happens first and then this kind of conversion and this kind of conversion. I don't think it works like that. Different people will be drawn in different ways. But if in youth ministry we can provide context where those things happen, I think A, we're providing a wonderful service to young people, but we're also preparing them for the kind of change that that encounter with God and God's love in Christ can bring. Last point, and then we'll have a little break. The attraction of practices. So Charles Taylor says that once upon a time what happened was that there was a thing called ordinary practice, which basically meant you went to church on Sunday, right? And that made you a practicing Christian or a practicing Catholic, right? What he suggests now is that what often happens because of the whole range, remember he talked about a supernova of beliefs and stances in relation to faith and spirituality that we can take. Because of that that whole range of possible options that are available to us, he says that what actually might happen now is rather than go from ordinary practice, I'm at church on Sunday and if I want to live a more committed Christian life, I might also go to a prayer group, or I might also do a Bible study, or I might also go and work at the soup van. He says it now works probably in reverse sometimes as well, that someone might actually start with the soup van, or they might start by saying, I'm really drawn to that journaling kind of thing that they see their friend doing or somebody that they know. Or they might find themselves saying, I really like belonging to that group of people. I really like hanging out with them. I don't believe everything they're into, but when they gather together for a coffee and they talk, I like being part of that. Those kinds of practices, more formal and more informal alike, they can be the doorway into what we call ordinary practice, yeah? And so part of that, I think for us, I think that's a challenge for us to rethink how we see some things, because sometimes what happens, say in a parish context, is we say, well, we want the young people to be involved, and we're delighted when a young person comes and puts their name down for the soup kitchen, or we're really rapt when they say, I'd like to give, helping out on children's liturgy a go, or whatever other kind of practice, But what we do at the moment that they show up and do that, we say, okay, great, we're going to sign you up for the roster. Okay, you're now on this for the foreseeable future. You're now committed to it, when really they were just exploring and checking it out. It was actually, rather than recognising this as a practice that's a doorway into something more, and therefore there's something tentative about that. They're not saying I'm paid up, I'm signed up, I'm ready to go, I'm fully on board. They're saying I'm just exploring and this looks like fun, I'll check it out. What we want to be able to do there, I think, is to be able to create a place where our ministries aren't dependent upon a young person being all the way there, but there's opportunities for them to experiment and try it out, that might then be a doorway for them into a deeper life of faith. Does that make sense? Okay. So I think we should press pause and... Questions? Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes for just if people have any questions. Again, I feel like I've gone very quickly. We can't say everything that could be said, but we'll have a go.
One of the things that struck me in your relational witness was in the book I was reading about Sherry Bodell. She talks about being a bridge of trust. So it's like we've got to be that bridge of trust to bring others to Christ, because they might not necessarily come to church, but they're seeing you as a witness.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's really important. And you might remember in the last session on the RCIA, I used Sherry's different thresholds and said that particularly that threshold of coming to trust, of becoming curious, they're very much witness kind of categories, right? I trust somebody, and then their life makes me ask questions about why are they the way they are? Why do they believe what they do? Why do they do what they do? Is it because of what they believe? And so that's very much kind of within that idea of witness. Yeah, thanks, Monica.
I'm thinking of the youth movement for climate change. Hundreds of thousands of them across Australia. Catholic schools, God only knows what else. Clearly they've got a socio-political, moral, whatever else conversion going on. And surely there's an opportunity there for their faith communities to receive them and to perhaps bring them into a fuller understanding of where that sort of urge to, for socio-political interest in climate change comes from, rather than just comes out of the air.
So I think one of the things I think is really important about that, and I think you're spot on to identify it. So one of the things I think that's really important about it is that Taylor's helpful here. He talks about maybe an ethic of benevolence or universal altruism, that he says is actually it's the parent of that ethic of that I actually have a responsibility to care for everybody on the planet. The parent of that ethic, which is a kind of secular ethic, or he says an exclusive humanist ethic, it's an ethic that's not necessarily grounded, it doesn't look like it's grounded in Christian faith. Taylor says the parent is absolutely Christian faith and the ethic of agape. So that when I am called to love, take the parable of the Good Samaritan, okay, I'm to love my neighbour. Who's my neighbour? Well, it's whoever's in front of me in need. What happens is that ethic, which is deeply embedded in the Christian gospel, as that goes through the process of secularization, it becomes an ethic of altruism, okay? And so when young people today, that large, broad umbrella of like a movement for, you know, addressing climate change, when that kind of movement emerges, it's the driving ethic will largely be that ethic of altruism. Where the church, I think, has much to offer there is to say, let's actually find the deeply rich Christian roots of what that looks like. So in the particular example that you were talking about of the stewardship of creation, richly biblical kind of theme about the way in which we're called to care for the earth and the theological reflection that's emerged from that, and to say, here's a resource that might help shape how we respond. So it's one thing to care for the environment, but what does that look like? What's permissible and what's not? Can you chain yourself to a tree? Can you take over a politician's offices? Can you base jump from a building to make your point? All of these things are questions in the expression to do something about this that you've got to make some judgments and decisions about. You've also got a resource there for trying to work out why we would do that. So I think that there's something there that we have to offer in a really rich kind of way that might actually, offer actually perhaps some reasons for sticking at it when it gets tough that maybe it's harder to do in other contexts. To say that the church is doing that, though, is another thing altogether. There's an opportunity that maybe we're not availing of ourselves in the way that we might.
I think during the week some young people in London actually tied themselves to the top of a train. So it shows the lengths they're willing to go to, and we want that sort of young person in the church, don't we? Anyway, wouldn't you love it if they were willing to lay down their life like that?
I'm not tying myself to a train.
No. Any other questions?
But I'm also not a young person. Ken? Father Ken?
I'm sure you've given plenty of thought to this one, Chris, but when I was reflecting on the RSA and everything in earlier years, I was thinking that the experience of the baptism of the Spirit would go in that early stage. Just how do you see it?
Okay. That depends a lot about what we mean by baptism of the Spirit, doesn't it? So I think that so the point, and we'll come to this after the break, but when the gospel is proclaimed, okay, when we hear that, when the kerygma there's a context where the kerygma is given, the proclamation of the gospel, part of that kerygma is that we've been given the Spirit of Jesus, okay, that brings us to faith in Christ, a deep personal awareness of Jesus. That, I think, so that in that case, if we're talking about that as baptism in the Spirit, then that absolutely belongs in that first stage, in the stage that we're just about to talk about that dimension of it. So if that's what we mean by it, then that's where it belongs, yeah. The only qualifier I'd offer to that is that, well, it might be that we want to recognise that there's another. So one of the advantages of that, let me back up a step. One of the advantages of that is that we can say that people can, if it's in that initial proclamation, they can be filled with the Spirit before they've ever been baptised, right? Which makes sense of, say, passages like the Acts of the Apostles where people they receive the Spirit and they haven't been baptised yet. If our theology of baptism says that the Holy Spirit has to come only at baptism or the subsequent appropriation of it, we can't explain those passages very well. So, but if we understand that in the proclamation of the gospel, in my response to that, I can be filled with the Spirit, then it absolutely belongs in that stage. For many people, perhaps, though, it's in the appropriation of their baptism more fully also that they receive the Spirit. And so there's something about that later kind of moment that also, and this is where you might, someone like Thomas Aquinas would talk about multiple sendings of the Spirit, wouldn't he? I think that can make sense of some of that process as well, or that experience too.
I just want to make a comment. You talk about authenticity and how young people were looking for that. And you also mentioned about fostering conversion through probably some sort of a forum where they can actually ask questions and not be told what it is that we are believing. The image of the church is still quite predominantly a very didactic sort of organisation. It's very instrument to teaching on passing on information on one side way. Do you see any change coming on board, or is like I'm not familiar with the Alpha course, but to what extent does that allow for questionings and debating, or is it something that you're thinking somewhere down the track that that's the direction the church needs to go to?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think as you were talking, I thought this is a classic moment of we need to be the change that we want to see, right? So I think that your observation is really spot on. Okay, I think that because we've understood, particularly those who are ordained, we've understood ourselves to be teachers. It's what I've been doing for the last hour, right? So we've understood, and so what that means is we keep telling. Okay, sometimes our response in that too is when people say we're not really listening, we've just tried to talk louder, and the hope that would actually make a difference. But I think we can create places where, and what happens is that if it's a genuine mutuality of dialogue that's established, where we give young people and also the not so young a chance for them to ask their questions without necessarily feeling like we've got to resolve or solve those, we also can have a chance to say, well, this is what we believe, or this is what we understand the Christian faith to be. So in answer to your question, I think it's one of the gifts of the way Alpha is set up is that it does do that. So that when people, the part of the kind of dynamic of Alpha is to say you can ask anything you like and no one's going to give you the right answer. So if somebody in the Alpha group says, well, I think Jesus was a Martian, you don't correct that. You don't say, well, it's got nothing to do with what we understand of Jesus in the Bible or in history and those sorts of things. You say, okay, what do other people think about that? Yeah? So part of that is trying to be non-judgmental about that. There's also an opportunity in Alpha for us to say, well, here is who Jesus is. This is what we understand. We know some things about Jesus from history outside the Bible as well as inside the Bible. I don't see any reason why youth ministry can't look like that, and that in that first stage, why we can't create places where young people can ask what they want, they can say what they want to say without us coming in and saying, oh, no, that's wrong. Oh, no, you need to know what it really is. Yeah. And so part of the shift there in this first stage, there's a place later for teaching and really developing something, right? That's after a young person has said, I think I've met this Jesus, and I think I've got a taste of his love, and I'm hungry to know more. Well, you can teach at that point because they've given you permission, as it were, to do so. Prior to that, there's a context by which we can say, let's create a place by which you can ask your questions, and we're not going to come down on you with the right answer. We're not going to correct you, but we're going to engage with it in a conversation with you about it. And Alpha would be a good model of how we might apply that. And I actually don't think it's that hard. I think it just is. I mean, one level I don't think it's that hard. I think it involves a retraining in our mindsets, because often we want to, in our real desire to say, I want you to know the real thing, we jump too quickly to telling and explaining without giving enough room for listening and letting people talk.